Okay, we're getting to the point that we're wrapping up our UCal 4 calibration course. If you review, if we think about where we've been, we started out with 4 lessons. We talked about some of the theory and principles that are involved with near-infrared spectroscopy. We then moved down to a whole series of exercises. We started out with the very practical, just moving data around, managing samples, managing constituents, graphics, things like that. Then we did some regressions and some qualitative analysis exercises. And we also talked about advanced sample selection or population structuring. So those are really the nuggets of creating and maintaining an IR calibration. In this presentation, I want to talk about some advanced topics and exercises. So for these topics and exercises, not all of these are going to be relevant and useful to everyone. The first 2 topics are really general, and I recommend that you for sure, at least in this lecture, listen to the first 2. And there are some exercises along with the minimization files. This can really be helpful to your calibration development. The remaining 3, most people will not use. The first one, instrument transfer, was historically used quite a bit with near-infrared. When near-infrared was started in the 70s, 80s, even going into the 90s, it was hard to make instruments that looked alike. So we had to use software and chemometric tools to make one instrument look like another one to facilitate calibration transfer. With newer instrumentation, and for example, on the SpectraStar XT with TAS, we really don't need to do this external manipulation to make the instruments alike. So this is rarely used, but we will talk about it briefly. There are some exercises. This might also be used if you've got calibrations from another instrument vendor, for example, and you bring it into the Unity world and you scan. You might use instrument transfer. Locally weighted regressions and condense are 2 techniques that you might use if you've got very large sample sets. So first, different ways of evaluating models and adjustments. And just want to talk about another way that you might do your validations or evaluate your calibrations. So if you remember, we talked about during the regressions, during calculate quantitative regressions or models, we talked about the monitor program and predict, where you brought in a spectrophile, an SVF, and a PRD, and we did the immediate evaluations. We could see the XY plot. We could also see the difference of the predicted values compared to the NIR value, to the laboratory values. So in the monitor program, it gives you all of the information that you really need to make these evaluations. But some customers prefer to do the evaluations outside of UCal. It just brings it into a tool that they're familiar with, so some sort of a spreadsheet program. So if you're doing it external to UCal 4, it requires, again, some sort of a spreadsheet program like Excel. Always remember that the difference you should calculate is lab value minus prediction. We always take the attitude that we are comparing what we're doing in near-infrared to the lab value. And this will make sure that the sign, positive or negative, of your corrections are always in the right direction. Standard deviation is your friend. Take a look at the standard deviations. It will help you understand if the NIR explaining all of the variation that you're seeing in your reference values. You can look at a t-value or a standardized difference. It helps you identify prediction outliers. When you're doing these evaluations, I think I talked about this earlier, but you need to be careful about removing samples that are outliers. And this will be a sense that you develop over time. But I was working on an evaluation yesterday with one of my colleagues, and there was a sample that was clearly a bad reference value. In this case, we knew it just by looking at one instrument prediction. We could just tell the spectral outliers, it was right in line. The global distance, neighborhood distance were very low. The biases were working in one direction. Most of them were around, for example, 0.3 or something like this one. And this was a minus, I think, 2.5 or something. So we looked at this sample when we were doing the evaluation. We immediately questioned it, and we're going to throw it out as being one that we questioned the reference value. Luckily, in this case, we had two instruments. It was a customer that had two instruments. So they also had this sample run on a second instrument. It showed the exact same pattern. So this is a sample that got mixed up, misnumbered. Something happened with the reference values, who knows, but it was a bad reference value. So we removed it. Our general rule that we use is that we allow about, and again, this is a personal rule, we allow us to remove 10% or less of samples as outliers. And for me, I want to have a good reason to be able to remove a sample as an outlier. It's not just to make our statistics look better. So be very cautious if you ever have more than 10% of the samples that you're removing, that you're taking an overly optimistic view of the situation. It's good to have 15, 18, 20 samples, and these samples, whenever you're doing a validation, should be diverse. Really, 10 or 11 samples is a minimum. If you get below that, you're getting to the point that you don't have a statistically valid sample. So we discussed those things when we were talking about the validations earlier. I'm putting this example up as a way that you might work in Excel to evaluate your samples. So this is just for one constituent. You've got your sample name here. These are your lab values. These are the NIR values, the predicted values. And then we've highlighted the different formulas that you would do for each of these columns. The first two are the important ones. The difference, remember that we're doing lab minus NIR, and the t-value, which helps you identify prediction outliers. Okay, then you go down and you're calculating your means, your averages, and your standard deviations. So here's the mean of the lab values. Here's the mean of the predicted values. And you can see that the bias that we would want to apply would be a minus 0.89, which makes sense. If we subtracted 0.89 out of here, we would get back to the lab or the reference value. Okay, so these are values that this bias is a value that could be directly inputted into UScan product settings. Okay, if you want to, you can calculate the correlation, you can calculate the slope, you can calculate the intercept. Okay, but as we mentioned before, we never do slopes at corrections unless you've got a really good reason. Slopes are just extremely dangerous to make, and they're really not needed in the vast majority of NIR calibrations. So, and one of the things about validations is that there are oftentimes samples that are a little bit clustered in values, because you're working in a production environment, you're working in whatever. So these samples tend to be clustered around the mean, which means that the correlation, the correlation is a statistic that's very range dependent. So your correlation might not be great in a validation. So, don't be too concerned if your correlation is not right, but because you're clustered around the mean, you can also get slopes that are not indicative of what is really happening with your calibration. So for the vast majority of these evaluations, you're going to be looking at a bias adjustment. And again, if you do the simple subtraction here between the means, you will get a bias that you can then input directly into UScan. So as we've discussed now, there are two different ways to do this. You can evaluate your models in UCal4 by doing a reprediction, or you can do it externally in the spreadsheet as I just showed you. So I just want to talk about and give you some cautions and recommendations. So if you're using the NI results from UScan, for example, as we saw in the last spreadsheet, they all must reflect the same product settings. In other words, bias settings, or the evaluations are not valid. If you look at the samples that have been analyzed for the last 6 months, for example, and you've made 2 bias adjustments in the middle of that, the predicted values reflect different adjustments, different bias settings in your product. So evaluating them as a group is no longer valid, okay? So be very, very cautious about that. Make sure that all of the NI results were collected on the same product settings. You can see that in UScan. If you pull up the samples and you go into details in the history view, it will show you the version of the products that were used, and just make sure that all the version of the products are the same. So another thing is, if a bias adjustment is needed, it must be added to the existing values in UScan, because the evaluation that you're making is based on the NI results with the current product settings. So in this example, we have a current bias in UScan of 0.11. If our new evaluation shows that a 0.16 bias is needed, our new bias in UScan should be the sum of those two, or 0.27, okay? Because we're biasing 0.16 over where we are right now, okay? Hopefully that's clear. If anybody has any questions, please talk to your KPM Unity product specialist, okay? Just as a contrast to this, if you're doing all of these evaluations in Monitor, Monitor is always doing a reprediction back to these sample spectra. So all of the samples are automatically on the same prediction basis, okay? They don't have any built-in bias that it's being reflected, okay? So that's one thing that's nice about doing the evaluations in Monitor. And also the bias numbers can be entered directly into UScan product settings, because the biases that you're calculating are bias adjustments directly from the model. And that's what UScan is doing as well. So in this example, if you were using these exact same samples and doing the evaluations in Monitor and UCal4, the bias that would be shown would be 0.27, and you can enter that directly into UScan, okay? So 2 different ways to do it. Neither one is right or wrong, but they're just handled a little bit differently. So I wanted to discuss that in these advanced topics. Let's jump into the next one, minimization files. So minimization files came out 20 years ago or so in this technology, 25. When I first heard about them, I thought it was honestly a gimmick, and I started using them, and they can be really great. Minimization files are files that can be used to compensate or to expose a specific variation to your calibration without putting those samples in your calibration files, okay? We'll talk about this in a second, but the way that they work is that we put a file into the regression, and it expresses and it represents specific variation. And what the minimizations do is they allow the regression to identify the wavelength regions that cause samples to express more variability. And the wavelength regions within these samples that are shown in your min files are actually downweighted so that they don't affect the results. You might pay a very small price in the standard error cross-validation. So you might get a couple hundredths of a % difference, decrease in your, or increase in your standard error, but this is far outweighed by making the model being, that is more robust. So this is what a minimization file would look like. You put samples in with the same sample number that were scanned and reflect the variation you want to compensate for. So a really easy one to understand is temperature. If you want your calibration to be insensitive to temperature, you could either scan your calibrations at all different temperatures and build that in through your calibration, build that variation in through your calibration, or you could make a minimization file that reflects calibration, temperature variation, and have all of your calibration samples just scanned within, the normal variation that you find in your laboratory, for example. So if I'm going to be using temperature in this discussion. So let's say we wanted to compensate for, in our laboratory, from 18 to 23 or 24 degrees C. We would take one sample in one sample cup, hopefully no repacks, no anything, the exact same sample in one sample cup on an instrument, and we would scan it at the various sample temperatures. So this might be at 17 or 18 degrees C, 19, 20, whatever, moving up to 24, 25, 30 degrees C, whatever the temperature range you want to express. Every instance of that sample scanning across all those temperatures has the exact same sample number, and that's the key to min file. This is the exact same sample across different temperatures. Then we take a second sample. This one might be a flower sample that's low in ash. This might be a flower sample that's mid-range in ash. And we will scan that sample across the same temperature ranges. Sample 3, sample 4, sample 5. You might do 5 or 6 samples, okay? So the min file are composed of samples that belong to groups, okay? You can have more than one group. All samples within a group must have the exact same sample name. And the samples within that group differ only in a single non-constituent variation. So in this case, temperature, okay? What do we do then once we've got a min file? Well, this is our file IO screen, input-output screen, when we're doing a quantitative model, okay? We've got the SVF file that came in. This is our output file. This is a PRD file here. And down here, we've got the opportunity to put in and input a min file. Okay, so enter your minimization file here. This is a key. These samples, bringing this variation into your calibration regression, are separate and outside of your input file, which was your SVF file, your calibration file. So once you make your minimization file, you just have it, and all your future regressions that you're doing, you just bring in your min file, and you're going to make your calibration insensitive to whatever variation that you're bringing in here. By keeping this part of your calibration and bringing this variation in outside of your calibration file, the bookkeeping becomes so much easier. And if you've got fairly similar sample types, once you make a min file, you can use it across your various applications, your various calibrations. So it's really, really useful. When you do bring in a min file, you now have one more setting that you need to deal with, which is min weighting. This is discussed in the help file, how it's calculated. 5 is a good place to start, okay? What you're doing is you're describing how much of an influence you want your minimization file to have. So the minimization file does a really good job of minimizing your non-constituent variation. And again, if we go back to overfitting and, we talked about the press plots and making your calibration stable and robust out in real world, out in production, this is another case that the minimization file does the same thing. It will make your calibration less sensitive to, for example, temperature changes in your lab. The global distances and the neighborhood distance will be slightly affected as well, but really the change is minimum. In my case, I used the minimization file when I was a customer years ago, and I've used it on many customers since this. They can make really significant changes. And this is an exercise when you're developing calibrations that you can spend a day or two making a minimization file, store it, And from that point on, every regression you make, any updates, any expansions you make, the min file is just sitting there ready to go. So I would recommend, if you've got a variation like temperature that can happen during your routine analytical situation, I would recommend that you take a look at minimization file as a way to bring in that variation into your system. There is an exercise on this, and you can see visually what a min file looks like, and you can try it and see what the effects are. The last thing I want to say about minimization files is that you could have two types of variation that you're dealing with. One of them might be temperature. One might be that you've got two different sample mills, and they produce slightly different grind sizes, for example. Or it might be two different instruments, or it might be different, I don't know, sample presentation, or sample bags, or something like that. You can combine multiple, I call them experiments, in a min file. Just make sure that whenever there's a sample number 1 in a min file, that it's the exact same sample cup and you're reflecting one type of variation. If you are expressing a different type of variation or trying to explain a different type of sample variation, even if you use that exact same sample, use a different numbering scheme. So what I used to do, for example, if I had temperature experiments, I would do 1, 2, 3, 4 for my sample numbers, and have multiple 1s for different temperatures, multiple 2s for different temperatures. But then if I had another experiment, another variation, I would start at 101, 102, 103. Okay. So the min file can handle multiple types of variation. You just need to keep the sample numbering clear. Okay. This is a great tool. If anybody has any questions, again, I like talking about this. This can really help stabilize and make your system more robust. Okay. Going through the rest of them, standardization or transfers, there is an exercise on this. This is up on the main menu bar. This is found under transfer, and there's a couple of exercises in here. The first one is looking at trimming, and this is just to make sure that your SVF files are all of the same wavelength range and also the wavelength increment. Okay, they must be this if you're ever doing a transfer. This is second experiment is looking at samples scanned on two different instruments. The STF file is a file that describes the differences. And this might be, for example, if you've got a different, if you're moving from one vendor to another one, you can move your calibration from a previous instrument platform to a new instrument platform. The STF file will describe the differences between them. You can also do a file transfer. It's exercise 503. You can take files from a previous system using the STF file, and you can move it to the new system, okay? So that the file appears like it was scanned on your new system or a second instrument, okay? And the last one is a spectrum compare or contrast, and you can evaluate your file transfer and how well it's done. So we're going to go through this really quickly. Again, most of you won't have to do this, but the exercises take you through step by step, and we'd be happy to help you through this. So trimming is, again, just making the files having the same parameters. There is an input screen. You've got your input file. You've got a template that you use in your output file. Okay, very simple. You put them in, and you can get that out. To create a transfer between instruments, we need to have a file that will hold and characterize the differences. And in our world, in the Unity world, this is an STF file. So the STF file contains all of the coefficients that allows you to characterize and change a spectrum to look like a master instruments, as if the master instruments had done the scanning. There are different algorithms that are available here. We usually find that it is best to use the piecewise direct standardization. It is a PCA-based method, and I would generally use one or two factors. If you remember when we were talking about complexity, we were talking about that when you're doing instrument transfer, that complexity also and overfitting also applies. So if you've got an option, always use the fewest factors. You're going to make the most stable instrument transfer. If you're working within the same model of instrument, you don't need any fancy math. Always use the first order. Okay. So instrument transfer, you've got a data set from an old instrument, you want it on a new instrument. And the key here is that you've got a matched set of samples. These samples should be ideally in the same sample cups. In the old days, a long time ago, we used to have sealed cups that we did this for. So, the samples wouldn't change at all. And you're scanning samples on your old instrument and the new instrument, and you're characterizing the difference. So here's typically what was done, scanning 20 samples. Make sure that the name of the samples is the exact same on both instruments. And they must be properly entered because they'll be matched in the algorithm. You then go through this process. You've got a master instrument. That's your target. Your host is from an instrument that you want to make look like your master instrument, and the transfer file, the output, is the file that characterizes the difference. Okay, you can do that. There's a calculation in here. And you've got the option to do different types of standardization types. Zero order, first order, second order, the piecewise direct. Again, if you're working with instruments of the same type, you just want to match them a little bit tighter, I would stick with first order. If you're making a significant difference, like across different instrument platforms, piecewise direct might be your best. Okay? You can compare this. These are before and after transfer. If you look very, very carefully, you can see that there are spectral differences. You've got two different ways of doing this. You can use a matched set, build your STF file, and you can make a PRD from the master-based spectrum file. In other words, your target. Then you can implement the STF on the host instrument whenever you're doing a prediction. So the STF, for example, can be input into UScan in the calibration method. Okay. Need to make sure that the serial numbers match. We'll talk about that in the beginning. But in this case, the serial numbers in the PRD and the host instrument will reflect what that master instrument is, what our target is. Okay. So basically, we're keeping our models in the master instrument space to look like the master instrument. Strategy 2 is that you can do the same thing, use the match set, do an STF file, but we can use file transfer to transfer the calibration so that it looks like now the master instrument. So we're moving the actual SVF file, the spectra, to look like the master file. So now when we make a PRD, it's directly looking like the master. We don't need to use the STF file in real time to always adjust our spectra to look like the master file. So in instrument strategy 2, we've moved our entire system and the spectra over to the master file. Okay, the new instrument. Think about that as being the new instrument. This is much easier to maintain, and I would highly recommend strategy 2. I'm going to skip over this, but if we do have some lock and key systems, if you are doing standardization, to make sure that you are doing it properly. In other words, if you've got a host file, but you've got with one serial number, but a PRD file with a master instrument file, we won't allow you to use those together unless you're using an STF file to update or to modify that spectrum. And in that case, we modify the serial number during the process as well. So I just want you to know that there is a lock and key. You might get some errors if you do this wrong. And again, if you're doing this and you're working with this, please contact one of our specialists, or I would be happy to help you out with this. There is a way that you can go in and alter the file information, the Spectra file information. You can change the serial numbers. We talked about that in one of our first couple of exercises. Control E, this comes up. You can change the serial numbers, and there's a save button down here. So you might be able to do that. So just our recommendation is to, for sure, use strategy 2. Use the advanced selection on the transfer set, and you can make it a more robust transfer set. Build your PRD with the transfer set and the SVF that has been moved over. Another thing we recommend if you're moving to, for example, our platform, is once you've made that transfer, once you've taken the SVF, you've modified it with that STF file, the transfer file. So now it looks like it's on the XT, for example. Add in some representative samples that were scanned on your new instrument. We call that inoculation, and that tends to just lock in the calibration transfer, okay? This has actually been done many, many, many times, and calibration transfer works very well if you follow these rules. You can go in and look at a difference plot. These are in the exercises, and your STF file, if you're ever curious, but you can plot those coefficients. You can see the scale is very minute, but it shows you across the different wavelengths where the STF file is making a change, okay? So a file transfer file, this is if you need to modify a file. You've got an input file, the STF file, the output file. So this is the file that would reflect the update, the modifications characterized in your STF file. And there is an exercise that looks like this. We also have a contrast tool. And the contrast tool allows you to compare two Spectra files. So if you think about what we were just talking about when we're making a move from a host file or an older instrument to a new instrument, a master file, or something like that, it's very useful to be able to compare the spectra. So this is an evaluation you can do. There is an exercise for this, but allows you to compare two SVF files. Both files need to have the same set of sample names. And the usual case where we use contrast is we look at a match set 1 versus the transferred version of the second one. So this would be the SVF file that's gone through the file transfer process with the STF file to make it look like number 1. And we can use the contrast tool to determine how close they match. So this is the bottom choice when you're looking at monitor. Up at the very top, it was Spectra file and product file, PRD, but towards the bottom, it's a bottom choice, the contrast tool. So it's an evaluation to see how well you've done. This is what the evaluation looks like. It puts things out in a noise perspective and from a bias perspective. You will not get a perfect correlation, but it should be close. And there are recommendations of what the limits should be in the help file. So the last two that we're going to talk about are two techniques that might be used if you've got very, very large sample sets, okay? So if you've been doing this for a while and you've got a calibration file that might have 1,000 samples in it, and that sounds pretty daunting, but for some very complex products like forages, for example, or compound feeds, you might want to have these very large calibration sets to describe an extensive amount of sample variation. Well, one of the methods that you can use, we've discussed already, is a standard quantitative regression. And there we're making a linear model that looks at the entire calibration sample set and builds a linear regression, a linear model based on that static calibration set. Another way we can do this is with locally weighted progression. And I term this a dynamic technique. And in this case, we're making a new model per unknown samples. Okay. So what we're doing is we are using one sample and querying a database, querying your group of calibration samples. We're finding similar samples, and we're making a dynamic or one-off calibration. And it starts with a query sample, and that's the sample to be predicted, or as I've been using through this course, your unknown, okay? This is your unknown sample. And locally weighted regression is designed to be a very wide-ranging prediction method. It can be very useful if you've got an extensive amount of sample variation to explain. It's also useful if your variation that you're explaining in your sample set is so broad that the linear relationships do not longer hold. And because you're making local regressions in various pockets of this larger calibration population, the nonlinearities don't affect your sample accuracy, your prediction accuracy. So this was described a while ago in this reference here. But basically, based on your unknown, the local regression selects the samples from your larger library, your calibration library, that are spectrally near your unknown sample. So we're going into a large sample set of, say, 1,000 samples, and we're saying, find me the 50 most similar samples. We're also doing this based on a constituent. So we're saying, find me the 50 closest samples for protein, then for ADF, then for NDF, okay? Once we find those samples, we make a very quick PLS model from those nearby samples, and then we predict that query sample to get a prediction, to get a result. So this is an iterative process. Again, it's constituent by constituent. We take that unknown sample, we query the database, 50 samples closest for protein, bam, we get a result, make a PLS model, get a result. Then we do the same thing for each constituent until we've completed that model. This is the screen for the locally weighted regression. So you can see that we've selected the regression type here. And when you do that, there are some new options that appear over on the right-hand side, okay? It's bandwidth, the number of samples, and how we're finding our nearest neighbor. So also, if we think back to a previous discussion that we had, we started out a lecture by talking about similarity and all of the different places in UCAL4 that we're finding that we're using similarity. Well, this is another case, and this is the core of locally weighted regression, is that we are making similarity measurements. We are using our unknown, finding the similar samples, and then making a quick regression. So what are the near samples? There are various methods that can be used to determine the proximity or the closeness or the similarity to our query or our unknown sample. Cosine similarity is a quick correlation. It's very fast. It's a very easy calculation. We can look also at the maximum spectrum difference or the score difference. So this is still looking at the raw data, and this is going into a reduced spectral space. You're using the score distance method. The number of factors serves two functions. So number one, we're defining the score space and the density of the score space. And there's a little note here that says not too high. Remember, as with all cases, if you push the math, if you go too far, if you select levels of the complexity that are too high, you're chasing noise or you're chasing variation that doesn't help you. So that's one of the things that it's doing. It's defining the score space. Okay. We're also setting the number of factors for the local PLS calibration that we're making. And here, in contrast to everything we've told you before in the course, excess factors really don't have that much of an effect here. And the reason is because we are working within this closed system right now. So overfitting is not as much of a concern because we're only going to use this calibration locally for this one unknown samples, then we're going to throw it away. So if you think about overfitting, our concern was what happens in the future when we go into production with unknowns that we haven't seen in the calibration. For this is a closed set. So the fear of overfitting is not the same, okay? In general, it's a good idea to keep factors under 10. So for a good place to start might be 6. So the bandwidth is a constant that we use when we're comparing distance. So it's scaling effect, okay? High values for the bandwidth put more weight on closer samples. Lower values do the opposite, okay? And they tend to apply more of an equal weight. This is a good place to start. You'll find in locally weighted regression that there are many different parameters. There are more parameters that you can do. A good place to start is 2. And from our examinations, this is a really good place to start. You might want to increase it slightly, possibly to 4. Okay. And it looks like this. And you're just defining how broadly you are looking. Okay. So this is the effect of the bandwidth. You're also going to set the number of selected samples. And this is very library dependent and a little bit product dependent. So this is the number of samples that you're reaching into your large calibration library and you're pulling out to make your local dynamic regression. We recommend that you use at least 50 samples. You need to get a certain number of samples just to be able to model some variation. If you can do 100, it's great. I haven't personally worked with a model yet that we had enough samples to work with 200. But with modern computers, selecting more samples is not really going to slow you down. So if your larger sample set, is a couple thousand samples and you can pick 100 to 200 samples, that's great. So you're getting a good mix of samples that you're making these local or dynamic calibrations, regressions for. You should have a data set much larger than the number of samples selected. So this is what I was saying, if you're up around, 1,500, 2,000 samples, you can get away with picking 200 samples, okay? Local regressions usually work best with a well-structured data set, 5,000 to 2,000 samples. If you get above 2,000, your performance will decrease a little bit, but again, our computers are getting so fast that's less and less of a concern. Okay, data set structure. Oftentimes we've got very diverse subsets or subgroups within our population. We need to make sure that they're represented. One of the things that, one of the areas that I've seen that locally weighted regressions work very well for is forages. We've got different types of haze, for example, grass hay, legume hay, mixed haze. In reality, most of the forage samples that come in are not easy to classify. But not only that, the classification might be wrong. If you've got independent quantitative calibrations for each of those hay types, by the time it gets to the analyst, it might have the wrong label on it. So they're going to analyze a grass hay with a legume hay calibration. It should throw some outliers. The outliers will be a little bit high, but the variation in forages is huge. Well, a real advantage of a locally weighted calibration here is that based on the spectra, it's going to reach into your large hay database and it's going to find the samples, no matter what their product classification, it's going to find your samples that are spectrally close, okay? I haven't brought it up until now, but this is the ultimate expression of a spectra-first approach. It is actually using the spectra to determine the calibration samples in a dynamic way and pulling those samples out and making a regression, a calibration based on them, okay? So in uCalibrate, you're going to make your PRD file as normal. The idea or the job of this PRD file will be to prepare your query sample for the predictions. And it also sets some basic parameters. When you do the regression and when you're using these in LWP, the locally weighted system, there's an additional file that has an extension of LWP. They must have the first part of the file name the same, and they will get imported, for example, into uCal as one, okay? The LWP contains the math-treated spectra of your calibration set. So the PRD is defining the system. The LWP is the library. It's the larger calibration library that that contains reduced samples that will be used for the calibration. So they're mathematically reduced samples. And UScan is a system that is set up to be able to use PRD and LWP models. So you will place both of these files into your models folder. When you build the calibration model profile, you will specify the PRD and it's going to find the LWP model, the LWP file, okay? From that point on, this is a special prediction type in UScan, and it knows it will automatically use both of those files and it will do a locally weighted prediction. So there is an exercise, a couple of exercises actually, and evaluations. This isn't a standard part of the UCal 4 class, but if this is something that you might be interested in, you might want to run through those exercises to see how they're working. But again, especially if you're starting, locally weighted regressions are not something that you will likely have enough samples for a while. But once you get to a point above 700, 800 samples, especially if you've got a lot of sample variation that you're trying to explain, wide-ranging product type, locally weighted regressions can provide you highly accurate, very accurate predictions. So I would encourage those of you that are a little bit further in the calibration path to take a look at locally weighted predictions. This is also one of these areas that is outside of building a simple quantitative model. And if you'd like to talk to one of our experts, please contact me or your KPM Unity product specialist. The last one, I'm just going to have one slide on. So this is also a technique. This is not used very often, but it's extremely valuable when you need it. And this is actually a patented algorithm that Unity Scientific has patented. So we call it condense. And if you remember, we were talking about calibrations, we were talking about expansions during the quantitative model types. And we said that, when you are doing a calibration expansion, it becomes effective when you've got at least 5%, hopefully 10% new samples. So if you've got, for example, a soy meal calibration and you've got a new extraction method or a new process going on in your factory, so your soy meal looks a little bit different. If you have a calibration set of 200 samples, you need to have at least 20 samples that are from this new process to be able to effectively update your calibration. 30 or 40 samples would probably do better depending on how significant that change is. Well, some of our customers that have been doing this for a while might have calibration data sets that are huge, or they might have inherited it from a previous vendor, for example. Well, when you get your calibration data sets to the point that they're very large, effectively updating them becomes very, very difficult. So one of the things we did is we developed a condensing algorithm. And what the condensing algorithm, it will take a very large data set and it will reduce it to a smaller data set, but still maintain all of that variation and still express all of that sample variation that was in the original. The way that we do this is we calculate PLS scores. And based on those PLS scores, we find unique samples, or we actually calculate unique samples that are a compromise or a condensation of very near samples. So what we're doing is we're kind of doing what we did in advanced sample selection to find the nearest neighbors and get rid of redundant samples, but we're doing it on our calibration set, and we're making a new calibration set that has many fewer samples. If we have a sample set that has, for example, 1,500 samples, we could reduce it down to 150 samples. And in that case, we would only need 15 or 20 samples to effectively update it, okay? Or we might reduce it down to 300 samples, for example. This is another case, contact us if you have a situation where you think condensing might be useful. I wanted to introduce it into this class because I wanted to plant this idea with everybody. For customers that are out there and for our users that are out there that find themselves in this situation, condensing can be a lifesaver because you can really effectively update your calibrations. And a couple of our customers have even diverged. They've kept their very large sample set for the main product, but they will condense, create a new calibration set, and then update it for an updated product, for example. So there are all different ways that you can use condensing, but the whole idea is that it makes it very easy and very effective to update your calibrations. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the advanced topics. I would encourage something I'd like everybody to be aware of. Your first calibration, you might not do a minimization file, but if you've got, again, this external variation that you need to make your system insensitive to, the minimization file can be incredibly efficient and do great things for you. We also talked about the way to do the external validation in Excel. A lot of our customers do that, especially those that are not that fluent in our calibration software. That's how they do their validations. Just keep those cautions and warnings in mind. And then we have the other advanced topics that we presented here. So those are represented in the various exercises that we have listed in the KPM Academy. And again, if you find yourself in these situations where you're using these advanced tools and you have questions, please contact the KPM Unity product specialist. And with that, thank you, everyone.